Hi, this is Jason K4APR, and in this video I'm going to basically take a PowerPoint presentation I created several years ago and try to just go through it and give a somewhat of a what I call a very simple understanding or simple explanation of DMR that gets you started. There's a lot of people out there who are interested in it, but it seems like they don't have a real good foundation of what DMR is or how it works. So I thought I would take this presentation and just try to do a quick little video. I don't know how fast it'll be, but go through these slides and maybe just do a basic explanation of DMR, and maybe it'll help a few people out there. So let's get started. For starters, again, my name is Jason. My call sign's K4APR. I've been licensed about 28 years now. I work in the commercial two-way radio world. That's my career has been in the commercial two-way radio world. So I find DMR, P25, a lot of the digital standards very interesting. It's always been a interest of mine. And I think DMR, and this is just a personal opinion, I think DMR is one of the better options because, one, it's been adopted by so many different manufacturers that there's a lot of different equipment to choose from now, so it's brought the price down. And in general, it's just a little more capable than some of the others out there. And hopefully by watching this video, you'll get an idea of why I'm saying that, and I'll try to point those things out as I go through this. So let's get started. So what is DMR? It was developed for the commercial radio industry by the ETSI. It's a Tier 2 protocol, and there are different tiers, but really what we need to concentrate on for amateur use is Tier 2. It's available for conventional use as well as trunking use. Trunking is going to be very rare in the amateur world, so we're going to really just concentrate on the conventional use. It is a digital radio format. It uses TDMA, which means there are time slots, and those two time slots means that a single RF channel can be used for two simultaneous conversations when talking through a repeater. And we're going to go through a little bit more of that as we get into further slides. We'll also talk about color codes. DMR is a good alternative to P25, mostly because the hardware is a lot cheaper, and when it's compared to Phase 1 P25, the audio quality may not be quite as good as P25, but you do get the time slots, which I think is a big advantage over P25 in the amateur world, considering a lot of times when you're trying to put a repeater up, you may not have the ability to put more than one repeater up. So utilizing that one repeater may result in essentially two talk paths and more capacity in use. DMR is basically the competition for what's called NXDN. NXDN is another commercially available digital format, but DMR again has some advantages over NXDN. I'm not going to really get into that with this presentation. My personal opinion is DMR is an excellent alternative over D-Star and Yaesu Fusion. Again, Timeslotting has a lot to do with it, as well as you'll find many people comment that DMR audio quality is significantly better than D-Star and Yaesu Fusion. Again, this is my suggestion or my opinion. Some people might take argument with that, and that's fine. Everyone has their opinion. Everybody's ears are a little bit different. So let's talk about time slotting. So the first thing we need to understand is that DMR is based on narrowband or a 12.5K space channel, not 25K like many hams or amateur radio operators are familiar with, but it's actually a 12.5K narrowband channel. But the time slots actually are split in half. It splits the channel in half into 6 1/4 per time slot. And by doing this, this is how we can have two conversations on the same channel. This graphic here kind of shows how the conversation is basically broken up into chunks, and that time slot 1 will take a certain amount of time, and then time slot 2, and then time slot 1, and so forth. basically the two conversations are split up and they are stacked in single file order on the RF channel. It's happening so fast, and the timing is coming. The timing is coming from the repeater that's controlling this, and the timing is so fast that you do not hear these little breaks. The audio is collected at the other end, and it's pieced back together, and you would never know the difference. So let's talk about talk groups. This is a concept that seems to be one of the more confusing things. Multiple groups of users on a single repeater can use multiple talk groups. Now, remember, we only have 2 time slots, so that means only 2 talk groups can talk at once. But that's already a vast improvement over a single channel analog only repeater. Each time slot is routed through the repeater, whether it's time slot 1 or time slot 2. And some example talk group numbers, I just threw a few up here that are pertain to my area where I live in Virginia. We use 3151 for Virginia statewide, 27500 for local, and I just happened to throw 810, the Mid-Atlantic region talk group up there. Now, talk groups are not RF channels. They are logical groups of radios that have selected this numeric ID. When you transmit through the repeater, your digital voice data is going to be encoded with this talk group number. Anyone who is not listening on that same talk group will not hear this transmission. And sometimes that's an odd concept to understand. But as we get into this, hopefully that's going to make a little more sense. Let's talk about color codes. Color codes are basically the digital version of PL and DPL. And I realize I have a error in my slide there. It's supposed to be DPL. Now, in the past, PL and DPL were either a subaudible tone or a digital subaudible tone that was transmitted along with the voice on the carrier. Color code doesn't work this way, but I use this comparison so that those who are familiar with PL will understand that color code is essentially a way of making the transmission either detectable or undetectable based on the color codes that's used. I'll give an example in the analog world. If I'm running a 100 hertz PL and on the receiver a 100 hertz PL is turned on, then the audio will pass through and the receiver will hear that audio. But if I'm using a 100 hertz tone on transmit and the receiver is set to 97.2, which I think is a valid PL, that receiver would ignore my transmission because it's set to the wrong frequency PL. Same concept in color code. I could have the same frequency, same time slot, same talk group, but if I'm using a different color code than what the receiver is set to, it's going to ignore it and you will not hear it. There's actually technically 15 color codes. Some say 16 because there are some out there that use color code 0, but I personally haven't seen that. So I say that it's color code 1 through 15. And one of the common color codes, as you may imagine, is color code 1. A lot of repeaters use that. So let's talk about a standalone DMR repeater. A standalone DMR repeater could be, for example, what I have here as an example, which is 444.880. That's the receive. That's your receive frequency from the repeater, meaning that's the transmit frequency of the repeater. And you would transmit to the repeater on 449.880, and the repeater would receive on that frequency. This is just an example. We're using color code 1. And in a standalone mode, most DMR repeaters are going to pass any talk group that you send to it. So I could use talk group 1, I could use talk group 10, I could use talk group 2700. Doesn't matter. It's going to pass it through. Now, if no one else on the repeater is listening to that time slot and that specific talk group, they're not going to hear me talking. So it is very important that you have some kind of coordination with your local group on what talk groups are going to be used for what, and color codes as well. Going back to that past slide, I showed an example of statewide for Virginia, which is 3151. If I was coming up on the repeater on 3151 and everyone else was listening to 3152, they were never going to hear me. Another thing to understand about DMR is that call signs are not as important. They are important as far as the FCC is concerned, as far as identifying yourself. But the real important thing in DMR is that you have a unique ID number assigned to you. And I put an example of radioid.net. This is pretty much the main location or main website that you would go to apply for an ID. As long as you have a valid amateur radio license, you should be able to get an ID. I threw a couple up here as an example. One of my IDs is 3151176. In the early days, the first 4 digits, a lot of times, if you live in the United States, would be your state ID. So, for example, Virginia's 3151. And they started with 3151000, and they issued those out till they got to 3151999. They've since ran out, and now they are using different numbers so they can keep issuing IDs. But this gives you an example. In some smaller states where DMR is not as popular, the prefix, 4-digit prefix, might still be available in the state that you live in. As far as in Europe and other countries, I'm not familiar with the naming or the number convention, but rest assured the ID number is going to be unique to anyone else. Okay, this is an example of a local call that's taking place on the repeater on both time slots. You can see the top 2 radios are on time slot 1, talk group 27500, and you can see the top left radio is 3151176, the top right radio is 3151181. Both of those radios can now talk to each other on time slot 1 on that same talk group, and they have unique IDs. The exact same thing is happening on the bottom with time slot 2. Both of those radios are also talking on that same talk group, but they're on a different time slot. They're on time slot 2. So the time slot 1 radios will not hear time slot 2 and vice versa. You can also see that the bottom left and bottom right radios both are using unique radio IDs. Here we have the same setup. The difference is we have a 5th radio that's come into the area. And now he has the choice of switching to either time slot 1, talk group 27500, or time slot 2, 27500, to talk to either the top 2 radios or the bottom 2 radios. And he can switch between those by having that programmed into his radio. And you can see that he also has a unique user ID that is different from the other 4 radios that were already talking on the repeater. These are some examples of radios. Some of these are still available. Some of these have been discontinued. But you can see on the left, there's a wide range of manufacturers that are making radios, and there are even more today that I don't have on this list. There's quite a few radios coming out of China and some of those other countries that are producing very decent DMR radios for a very low cost. As you can see, I put a price range of $160 to $800. That probably could be adjusted. I've seen radios as low as under $100 on up to over $1,000 for very, very high-end advanced DMR radios. I also put a picture of a Motorola repeater. Now, this is an older model repeater that is no longer available, but there are similar repeaters available on the market. DMR also supports text messaging. You have the ability to send short text messages from radio to radio. You can do this in one of 2 ways. You can either send it directly to the ID number of the person you want to send it to as a private message. You can also send it to a group, and that's usually done by sending it to the talk group number, not the individual user ID. And when you do that, anyone on the talk group that's currently selected on that talk group will receive the message. There are some cases where some manufacturers' text messaging won't work with each other. This has improved over the years, But in general, Motorola will talk to Motorola, Hytera, Tytera will talk to each other, and Vertex will talk to each other. But like I said, over the years, there has been some improvements to this, and in some cases, some manufacturers can talk to other manufacturers. Some repeaters support a mode called dynamic mix mode. This is a case of where the repeater can be set up to automatically detect if the users are analog or digital. It's important to note that the repeater cannot convert one to the other. So if you have an analog user, they cannot talk to a digital user. The repeater will not convert their analog to digital and vice versa. It's either all digital users or all analog users. It's also important to point out that if it's all digital users, they can continue to use the time slots as described previously. But if there's an analog user on the repeater will revert to all analog and the time slots will not work. So you can't have users talking on one time slot in digital and then have analog users using the repeater also. It's one or the other. There is a option to link repeaters, and this is typically done through something called a C-bridge. There are some other options out there, but C-bridge is one of the more common ways of doing this. And the repeaters can be linked together that allow cross-network or cross-repeaters. For example, in the state of Virginia, we have well over a dozen repeaters throughout the state. They're all connected to either one or more C-bridges. And most of those repeaters cover the 3151 statewide talk group on time slot 2 all the time. Meaning that if you key up on one of those repeaters on 3151 on time slot 2, your audio will be passed to all those other repeaters, and those other repeaters will also repeat your audio, widening the coverage area and increasing the chance of finding someone to talk to, for example, if you're just rag chewing. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to put those into the comments at the bottom of the video, or the comments for the video. I'd be more than happy to try and answer those. I know this was a very quick overview, and there's a lot of details of DMR that I did not put into this presentation, but I wanted to at least give a basic understanding of how DMR works, and maybe spark an interest in someone who's been thinking about getting into DMR but thought it was too complicated. I want to thank everyone for watching. Please like this video. A thumbs up is always appreciated. Consider sharing this video. And if you're not subscribed, I always appreciate you subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll talk to you on the next video.